record in the Simpson matter. Mr. Simpson is again present before the court with his counsel, Mr. Cochran, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Scheck. People represented by Mr. Clarke, Mr. Darden. Jury is not present. All right, counsel, anything we need to take up before we invite the jurors to join us? Mr. Thompson.
Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution asked for discovery of a successful grant proposal that Dr. Gerdes filed with the Advanced Technology Program of the National Institute for Standards and Technology. We have received from Dr. Gerdes' lab a copy of that grant proposal. However, there are serious concerns here about valuable proprietary information contained in this proposal. This is a proposal for a highly competitive U.S. government technology grant. The United States government found this proposal sufficiently promising with regard to the development of economically valuable new biotechnology that they awarded Dr. Gerdes and his laboratory $1.7 million to pursue it. However, the technology has not yet been developed. His laboratory has invested a considerable amount of time and money into developing this valuable technology, and they have proprietary rights to it. Therefore, we're extremely concerned about the public release of this information, and we're seeking a protective order.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to direct that no copies be made of this proposal, that it remain here in the custody of the clerk, be available for inspection by counsel for either party, and that before any cross-examination goes into it, we'll have a sidebar to determine whether or not that's an appropriate area of cross-examination.
That sounds quite acceptable, Your Honor.
And that at the conclusion of Dr. Gerdes' testimony, the copy we have will be returned to him.
That's fine, Your Honor. Shall I give the copy to the clerk then?
Please.
Okay.
Mr. Clarke, have you had the opportunity to look at this?
I've not.
All right.
Just one request, and that is, could we simply be able to read it upstairs? I expect it is lengthy and detailed. All right. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Deputy McNair, let's have the jury, please. Please be seated. All right, let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Good morning, everybody. All right, Dr. Gerdes, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, the record should reflect Dr. John Gerdes is on the witness stand undergoing direct examination by Mr. Scheck. Good morning again, Doctor.
Good morning.
Doctor, sir, you were reminded you were still under oath, and Mr. Scheck, you may conclude your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Dr. Gerdes, just a few more questions. First, I believe we discussed yesterday that in your work with transplantation and infectious disease screening, you mentioned that that there are policies, protocols, rules with respect to maintaining the integrity of samples when they're received and handled in the laboratory. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you said that there are, in your paternity testing area, there are what, chain of custody procedures?
Yes.
And what are those?
Well, there are safeguards to ensure that we are analyzing the appropriate individuals in that case. Basically, it simply means that every person that handles the specimen has to record that fact or document that fact so that you can follow the history of that particular specimen and know exactly where it came from and who and at what time that was handled, that specimen, who handled the specimen, when it was handled, how it was transported to the laboratory, and what state did it arrive, and all of the details that would be important to guarantee that that particular specimen is indeed what it's supposed to be, and that there was no possible chance that that specimen might have been tampered with or in some way compromised.
Now, Dr. Gerdes, even in the transplant work, if you receive a tube of blood that a doctor says is a tube from a particular person, but it doesn't have certain kinds of proper documentation, what are the rules and procedures in regard to that?
Well, according to CLIA 88, which is the law in a clinical laboratory, if a specimen arrives at the laboratory without an appropriate request form specifically stating what test is to be done, and if the specimen has not been labeled with the patient's name, we cannot analyze it.
What do you do?
Well, you call the physician and you tell them that an error has been made and have them redraw a new specimen.
What is the practice and procedure with regard to the receipt of specimens in packaging that shows evidence of having been opened and then repackaged?
Again, that's a break in the chain of custody. That item could not be analyzed. We would inform the individuals, the parties involved, and we would start over.
So in other words, the history of the handling of a sample is a lab question, a scientific issue.
Yes.
Doctor, do you have an opinion about the reliability of DNA testing results on samples recovered from the Bronco console on August 26th, that is samples 303, 304, and 305?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustain.
All right, have you examined the results and the history of the samples 303, 304, and 305?
I have.
All right. And do you have an opinion with respect to the those results?
Same objection.
Sustain. I'm more concerned about the history aspect.
Do you have are you familiar with the testimony and the documentation as to what happened to the Bronco after samples were first collected on June 14th?
Yes.
All right. And are you aware of what happened to the Bronco and the console, where it went, what procedures were involved in maintaining its custody until the time it was then again sampled on August 26th?
Yes.
Now, do you have an opinion about the integrity and reliability of the DNA test results on the samples recovered from the Bronco console on August 26, 303, 304, and 305?
Objection, no foundation beyond the expertise of the witness.
Overruled.
Oh,
Yes.
And what is it?
Those samples have obviously as I just described, the chain of custody aspect of those samples has been broken. We don't know what, or at least we can't be assured that something or someone or number of individuals might not have been in there. In fact, there's testimony that I've read that states that in fact happened.
Well, excuse me, objection, move to strike, no foundation.
Yes. That part of the answer will be stricken.
Based on just the integrity of the sample handling of the Bronco, do you have any confidence in the results of those, from a scientific point of view, in the results of those tests?
No, you can.
foundation.
Over.
Beyond the witness's expertise.
Over.
You can no longer have any scientific confidence in that.
Now, there was a question I forgot to ask you yesterday, and I apologize for it, concerning the charts and the data that you put together in your analysis of strips, runs, and extraction controls and negative controls in the period of May through July of 1994 and the overall charts. And that is, did you include in your analysis the strips and 2 runs that were involved in this case?
No, I didn't.
Why not?
Well, the purpose of that analysis was to assess the level of contamination before and after this specific incident case. And so that's why I did it that way.
I have some additional questions now about RFLP results. I believe you gave us testimony yesterday concerning your views of the RFLP result on LAPD item 52, and which was analyzed on the morning of June 14th by Mr. Yamauchi, correct?
Yes, yes.
All right. And you've expressed your opinion and concerns with respect to that RFLP result.
In terms of cross-contamination, yes, it could be cross-contaminated.
Now, let me ask you about some other RFLP results. Do you feel that cross-contamination could have accounted for the RFLP results consistent with Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson on the Rockingham glove?
Objection, no foundation, also leading.
Sustained.
All right. Have you looked through the amount of DNA and the paperwork on the analysis performed on the RFLP tests done on the Rockingham glove with respect to results consistent with Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson?
I have,
All right. Have you actually seen those order ads?
yes.
Do you feel that cross-contamination could have accounted for those RFLP results?
Objection, no foundation, calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Well, do you question those RFLP results on the grounds of cross-contamination?
Same objection, also leading.
Sustained.
All right. What is your view of those RFLP results?
Same objection.
Sustained. Foundation here, counsel.
Have you reviewed the data on those results?
Yes, I have.
All right. Do you feel, what is your opinion in terms of the issue of cross-contamination in those results?
Same objection, foundation also calls for speculation.
Sustained on foundation.
The amounts of DNA in those samples, do you have an opinion about whether or not cross-contamination could have accounted for those results?
Objection, foundation.
Sustained.
Have you looked at the amounts of, have you reviewed the amounts of DNA that were used for the RFLP tests in those samples?
Yes,
All right. Have you reviewed the paperwork and the procedures used by the laboratories in testing those samples?
yes.
Do you have an opinion as to whether or not, what is your opinion with respect to the issue of cross-contamination in those RFLP results?
Same objection.
Sustained.
No. Your Honor, I'm confused. Does the amount of DNA that is used with respect to, that is involved in an RFLP test and the sample handling procedures that precede it have a bearing on the issue of cross-contamination and RFLP results?
Objection, leading.
Overruled.
Yes, it does.
All right. What is your view with respect to the RFLP test results consistent with the genotypes of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson on the Rockingham glove?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
Your Honor, may we approach?
Proceed.
Are you questioning those results?
Same objection.
Sustained.
I don't know. You have experience doing RFLP testing in your laboratory?
Yes, I do.
All right. Do you take the analysis of different RFLP test results separate and independently? In other words, would you evaluate the have you evaluated separately the RFLP results, in this case, on each sample individually?
Yes,
And you have different opinions about different ones of those RFLP results?
I do.
Objection, no foundation.
Overruled.
All right. Can I ask you now, what is your view with respect to the issue of cross-contamination and the RFLP results on the Rockingham glove, those that are consistent with Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson?
Same objection.
Sustained. Let me see counsel over at the sidebar with the court report, please.
As part of your analysis of the RFLP results, have you considered and evaluated the sample handling procedures with respect to, for example, the Rockingham glove?
Yes.
Now, what is your view with respect to whether or not cross-contamination could have accounted for the RFLP results consistent with Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson on the Rockingham glove?
Objection, no foundation.
Overruled.
In that particular case, there's an adequate amount of DNA. It could not have been explained by cross-contamination.
Now let me ask you with respect to the RFLP results obtained by the Department of Justice in Cellmark on the SOC, particularly the cutout section 13A. In terms of your review of the laboratory notes and how those samples were handled and the RFLP test results, do you believe cross-contamination could account for the RFLP results obtained on the SOC?
No, there's an adequate amount of DNA. Cross-contamination could not have accounted for that particular RFLP.
All right. Now, do you know how blood got on that SOC?
No, I don't.
Do you believe that have you reviewed the RFLP result on the LAPD item 117, a blood stain collected from the back gate at Bundy on July 3rd?
Yes.
All right. In terms of the way that sample was handled, what samples it was handled with, in terms of reference tubes and other matters, and the amounts of DNA, is there anything that leads you to believe that cross-contamination could account for that RFLP result?
On the back gate?
Yes.
No. There's an adequate amount of DNA.
So you're distinguishing between those results and the RFLP result on item number 52?
Yes, item 52 has significantly less DNA. It has only 25 nanograms of DNA, and that certainly could have occurred, especially in the manner in which these samples were handled. That particular item could have occurred due to cross-contamination.
And the events you described to us yesterday between
Yes.
9 and 11:20
That's correct.
on June 14th?
Correct.
Now, Dr. Gerdes, do you consider have you heard paternity testing referred to as forensic science?
Some people refer to it as that.
Because forensic, I suppose, has a definition that if it relates to court, sometimes it's called forensic, quote unquote.
Yes, some people define, forensics could be defined as a situation in which science and the practice of science interacts with law.
Now, when we were discussing yesterday the contrast between clinical applications and forensics, did you take forensic to mean having to do with the application of DNA technology to crime scene samples?
I believe that's what we were talking about at that time.
And so with that definition of forensic in mind, let me ask you these questions. First of all, in terms of your primary activities, are you a forensic scientist?
I don't consider myself a forensic scientist, no.
Have you ever gone to a crime scene and done collections?
No, I haven't.
Does your lab do forensic cases, that is, samples that are taken from crime scenes?
No, we don't.
You do paternity testing?
We do paternity testing.
Do you attend forensic meetings with members of police labs, government labs, et cetera?
No.
Based on your background as a microbiologist, a molecular biologist, and a DNA lab director, doing the kinds of things you've described to the jury, do you feel you were able to assess the sample handling techniques, the methodology, and the testing processes of forensic DNA laboratories that you've reviewed in this case, and I think you told us the 23 others that you reviewed previously?
Yes, I believe I can.
And you're familiar with their protocols and their practices?
I am.
Now, this report, DNA Technology and Forensic Science,
Yes.
this is by the National Research Council of the National Academy of Sciences?
That's correct.
All right. And was this an analysis of the application of DNA technology to forensics in the sense that we've been just discussing it here, analysis of crime scene samples and the like?
It was.
All right. And do you support the recommendations and analyses in this report?
I do.
Objection calls for hearsay.
Oral.
Now, are you familiar with the members of this committee and who they are?
I don't know them personally, but I'm familiar with their credentials.
Some of them included forensic scientists,
I believe there are perhaps 3 individuals there who were forensic scientists, yes.
including Dr. Henry Lee?
Yes, Dr. Lee is
That-
one of those.
I'm sorry. Now, the chairman of this committee, Dr. Victor McCusick, is he a forensic scientist,
No, he's not.
but a molecular geneticist and
That's
biologist?
correct.
Dr. Haig Kazazian, what field is he in?
I believe it's in genetics.
And the medical applications of DNA technology?
Yes.
Dr. Mary Claire King, is she a forensic scientist,
No.
but a molecular geneticist,
Molecular
population
geneticist, yes.
Dr.
Excuse me,
Eric,
Gentlemen, you're going to have to stop talking at the same time.
that's my fault, Your Honor. I'm really trampling on his answers. My apologies. Dr. Eric Lander, is he a molecular geneticist and population geneticist?
Yes.
All right. Is he a forensic scientist?
No.
Dr. Thomas G. Marr of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, Is he a molecular geneticist and biologist?
Yes.
Is he a forensic scientist?
No.
Now, one last series of questions, Doctor. We discussed the issue of proficiency testing a little bit earlier. Are you familiar with the discussion of proficiency testing in the National Research Council report?
I am.
Do you support those conclusions?
Yes.
All right, I'd like to direct your attention to, if you, would the court like to see them first before I read them?
What page?
We just have a reference for,
Sure.
for any question.
About page 100.
I'm sorry?
Never mind.
Starting at page 89, the second and third paragraphs.
Please have a moment now.
Mr. Clarke?
Yes, may we be heard?
Yes.
Doctor, I'm going to start reading a paragraph that's at page 89 of the NRC report and ask of your, what's your view of it and ask you to explain it.
Objection, hearsay as phrased.
Overruled.
Laboratory errors happen, even in the best laboratories, and even when the analyst is certain that every precaution against error has been taken. It is important to recognize that laboratory errors on proficiency tests do not necessarily reflect permanent probabilities of false positives or false negatives results. One purpose of regular proficiency testing under standard case conditions is to evaluate whether and how laboratories have taken corrective action to reduce errors. Reported errors should be based on proficiency tests that are truly representative of case materials with respect to sample quality, accompanying description, etc. Tests based on pure blood samples would probably underestimate error rate, and tests based primarily on rare and extremely difficult samples, which might be useful for improving practice, would probably overestimate. Although the California Association of Crime Lab Director proficiency test was less than ideal, being open rather than blind and not requiring reporting of size measurements, the materials appeared to have been representative of standard casework. Now, do you agree with that judgment of the National Research Council?
I do.
Do you agree? Why is it important to have proficiency tests on samples that are representative of casework?
Well, I think as it tried to explain in that paragraph, you want to make the test at the same difficulty as what you're going to try and analyze. So if you make the test too easy, you don't really get an accurate reflection of what your error rate is, how often you might make a mistake. So you want to try and mimic exactly the type of thing you're going to analyze as possible.
And in terms of having a blind test administered by an outside agency, why is that important?
Well, if you know you're being tested, you just naturally try a little harder. And if you, so both in the clinical field, it's on our proficiency test that we have to state, I even have to sign that I'm going to handle a sample the same way I would handle any other sample that came in from a patient. And you just put it in with that batch that day and run it. And the same technician runs it, so you don't have the hot shot in the lab that's better at this do it. So that way you have an accurate reflection of exactly how many errors might occur or under your standard operating procedures.
Now, Dr. Gerdes, you mentioned that the National Marrow Donor Program, that is an external blind.
Yes.
Are all the proficiency tests that your lab undergoes from the various different agencies, are those all external blinds?
No, they're not.
All right, some of them are open tests?
Yes.
Now, in terms of the proficiency tests, just in terms of the samples that LAPD ran, were those, in your judgment, representative of the kind of samples that were being analyzed in this case?
You're referring to the validation specimens?
I'm actually referring to, well, both the validation specimens and the CTS and CAP proficiency tests.
Yeah, all of those specimens represented specimens with adequate DNA. They weren't degraded, they weren't aged, or they didn't mimic the crime scene specimens in any way.
Mm-hmm. And this case involves mixtures of blood stains, some of which are degraded?
Yes.
And were there, in any of the labs that you've looked at, DOJ, the tests they took, Cellmark, LAPD, were they doing proficiency tests on those kinds of samples?
No.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
All right, Mr. Clarke?
Take a break, would that be possible? Gather materials.
How long do you need?
I think it will really be more up to the defense how long they feel they need to review some materials.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a early break at this point. Remember all my admonitions to you, and hopefully we'll get back to you in about 20 minutes. All right, ask you to step back into the jury room, please. On the record, in the Simpson matter, all parties were again present. Mr. Scheck?
I don't know how Mr. Clarke wants to proceed in terms of itemizing these things, but there's one chart entitled Los Angeles Police Department PCR DQ Alpha Testing Controls, 1 through 6. I have no objection to that. There's another chart. Where's the one with the number of samples?
If we could, if we're going to go through these, may I ask the court that the witness be excused?
Yes. Just wait outside, Doctor.
There's another chart or piece of paper which lists the number of samples and controls. In this case, I have no objection to that. Actually, Mr. Clarke allowed Dr. Gerdes to look at that so we could just count them up and make sure they were correct. There are a series of quotations in slide form from the National Research Council, and I think on just about every one of them, I have an objection that they're taken out of context. That is to say, in every single one of them, it's sort of on the one hand, on the other hand, and they only give the one hand that favors them, and they'll leave out the next paragraph or they'll leave out sentences. And I don't know how the court wants to deal with that, one by one as they arise, or in the context of the cross-examination, or right now. There's a whole series of those.
Well, counsel, I think I've allowed you pretty free access to the NRC report. So my inclination is to allow them to point out whatever discrepancies they have, and if you feel that under 356 that there's a larger context, I'll allow you to bring that in.
Yeah, that, maybe we could just deal with it on a case-by-case basis and save time, because that's really the nature of the objection in each instance.
Okay.
There's another two pages called DNA Testing, PCR, and RFLP Consistent Results, wherein they list, all they say is driveway, foyer, bathroom, RFLP number 12, PCR number 12, number 6, number 7, number 14. Then they do the same thing for the glove, the socks, the walkway, Goldman's boot. And I think that this is very misleading because it doesn't even indicate what the results are, who it's consistent with, and where, and what labs did it, et cetera. But the number one objection is it doesn't indicate who.
What it is, okay.
Yeah, and so I have a problem with that. And that's similar to objections I have. I think the only thing left, Woody, is the boards. The two boards, maybe we should pull those out. One board, perhaps we should take up first, called Concordance Cellmark DOJ.
Concordance,
Yes.
okay.
Given the care that we've taken with these words on boards, I don't like the word concordance in terms of being argumentative, but that's not really the thrust of
No, if you
the
may have,
objection.
well.
I think the real problem here is, again, all that's being done is listing items, listing probes, listing systems, and it's not informative as to what is consistent, what isn't consistent. There are tremendous complications here. We've had testimony, for example, on the steering wheel about Cellmark calling this 1.1, 1.2, and 4 as a mixture. The Department of Justice took a very hedged position, I'll put it that way, on this issue. So I think that this is all very misleading, and we have result boards that lay all this out, and I think this is unfairly argumentative and leaves out too much information and is really final argument and misleading.
All right, Mr. Wooden, is there another board that goes with this?
There's another board.
All right, this is entitled Results of RFLP DNA Analysis.
And again, this is something of improvement insofar as it at least lists the people involved, where there's consistencies. But again, it seems to me that, and in fact, I think this precise board was once ruled upon by the court in the context of the testimony of the other witnesses. I may be wrong, but I think it was a similar
No,
case.
this is the first time I've seen this one.
Well, there was one that just basically, it's an attempt to group certain RFLP results here, and it just seems to me that we have those result boards, and it's going to become unduly confusing, frankly. There's so many boards with so many results repetitively that I think that it gives the impression of it becomes cumulative, and I think it's unfair. They can go back to their initial results boards, which are organized by evidence item, and lab, and work with that and go through it with the witness, so we're dealing with the same set of data that's more complete data than are on these boards. And I think that that's an adequate way to do it in terms of presenting this to the jury, and it becomes unduly confusing and cumulative. And those are my objections to these boards.
Mr. Clarke?
Yes, Your Honor. With respect to both these boards as well as the two charts that I believe Mr. Scheck addressed, perhaps I can address those 4 items first. We're in a different setting now than we were when we were examining witnesses as to results. This particular witness has called into question a number of items of evidence that have been tested for DNA in this case. He's called them into question by raising the specter of, in particular, cross-contamination. The witness is not present, so I will offer to the court that this witness has repeatedly testified in the past that if you have an RFLP result on a sample, that confirms the reliability and validity of a PCR result on the same sample. This board, I would see, will be, in my view, extremely important to convey that to the trier of fact about what this witness either will concede on the witness stand or will be sought to be impeached by previous testimony, that the role of these RFLP results is absolutely central for the reliability, in his opinion, of the results in an individual case. Now, the particular board that's up now entitled Results of RFLP DNA Analysis is a way of presenting that information without having to put 6 boards up one by one, and having to point out individually what particular samples we're referring to. This places the RFLP results in one location. It's not argumentative. It accurately conveys exactly what previous testimony has described. With regard to the concordance board, this witness has again opened up the specter of the unreliability of a number of the results in this particular case. One of, again, this witness's central notions from previous testimony is the importance of replicate testing, testing by more than one laboratory. In this case, as the evidence has already showed, there's been testing by 3 different laboratories. So this concordance, the consistency in terms of the ultimate results obtained by these various technologies is again central to demonstrating through this witness the reliability of these results.
Briefly respond. I think Mr. Clarke's argument proves too much, because I think it's quite clear from this witness's testimony that his attack was only on one RFLP result, and that is item 52 that was handled in the evidence processing room on June 14th by Mr. Yamauchi under circumstances where he described it to be an unacceptable risk of cross-contamination. That's the only RFLP result that his testimony questioned, and we took all these other ones out. So it seems to me that to bring up a board, it is obviously cumulative. They should attack, if they want to attack him, they can attack him on that one. He's conceded he doesn't quarrel with the others. But this concordance of Cellmark and DOJ results is highly misleading and totally improper because it conflates results that are not spelled out in terms of the different typings which are at issue here, and they don't comport with what Mr. Clarke is saying, and that is, there's an RFLP that confirms a particular PCR-based result, et cetera. So I think that this one is just, there's very little question in my mind that this is highly misleading, argumentative, incomplete, and improper, and it oversimplifies the issues here. It doesn't even list included, not included, who this is. I think this concordance board is plainly improper on a whole host of grants. And as to the RFLP DNA analysis board, it seems to me they can rely on the other one that they already have up there, and his argument admits that what they really want to do is put up a whole series of results which he doesn't question yet another time, when the doctor has come in here and essentially just questioned one RFLP and the circumstances surrounding it. So it seems to me that this argument really admits that the true intention here is to create yet another board in a case of many, many boards that would be confusing. And as far as that other set of lists, did you take mine? The court should really see these, I think. Do you have yours on? You need a copy for me. Here. Those are, again, highly misleading. They don't even list who's involved and what the results are.
All right, these are entitled DNA testing, PCR, and RFLP consistent results. They have to do with both items from Rockingham and from Bundy. All right, Mr. Scheck, anything else? All right, Mr. Scheck, I think you downplayed the breadth and scope and effectiveness of your own presentation yesterday. I think you've opened up a whole line of questioning regarding the entire evidence collection process, how it was processed at the LAPD lab, and calling into question all of the subsequent results. I agree with you that, for example, the results of RFLP DNA analysis is cumulative in the sense that that information is included on several other boards, but since it compacts all of that information into one board, I find that it serves a relevant purpose, and it will save court time to have these two particular large boards here, so I'm going to overrule your objections.
Excuse me, could I ask the court to, I understand the court's ruling with respect to the RFLP DNA analysis board, but I'd ask the court to consider the concordance board, because I don't believe the concordance board does that. If
No,
you
I think
take a
the
look at it.
concordance board, though, it shows consistency of results from different laboratories.
No.
So, all right.
But
That's-
this is misleading, because take, for example, the,
Counsel, I've heard your argument. I've ruled.
well, can I just be heard just with respect, there's one thing I left at. Call the court's attention
I've
about the
ruled.
steering wheel.
Counsel, I've ruled. Thank you. Let's have the jury.
And I assume there are no objections to the other items that I displayed as defense.
I assume that as well.
Well, what about the, Your Honor, what about this where they don't even list who it is?
Objections overruled.
On this?
Yes.
Well, Your Honor, they don't even list who's involved. They just have item numbers.
I know, and it's on other items. It's on other pieces of evidence. It's on other display boards. I
No,
ruled.
but it's repetitive of those other
Counsel.
boards.
I think I've said it now 3 times. Thank you. Let's have the jury, please. All right, let the record reflect we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Dr. John Gerdes is on the witness stand, now undergoing cross-examination by Mr. Clarke. Mr. Clarke.
Thank you, Your Honor. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Morning, Dr. Gerdes.
Good morning.
Your Honor, if I may, I would like to use People's Exhibit 259, the Bronco results board.
Yes. Mr. Wooden. Where are you going to place the easel?
In the middle slot.
All right. All right, Dr. Gerdes, you'll need to step down to see that.
Dr. Gerdes, this particular results board, People's Exhibit 259, have you had an opportunity to either see this board or a recreation or copy of the board, if you will?
I've seen brief glimpses of this in TV coverage. I have not seen a copy in any other manner.
All right, I'd like to refer your attention, if I could, to what's labeled Exhibit Number 30, Center Console. And with regard...
Item 30.
I'm sorry, item 30. Thank you, Your Honor. And in particular, there are results from the Department of Justice in both the DQ Alpha and D1S80 markers. Is that right?
Yes.
Those results you are familiar with, is
I'm
that
familiar
correct?
with the results, yes.
All right. Is it your testimony, Dr. Gerdes, and are you telling the ladies and gentlemen of this jury that the DNA in that particular stain could not have come from the defendant, Mr. Simpson?
I am saying that due to the way in which these samples were handled, the testing that was conducted in that lab, subsequent testing in that lab, there's a possibility of cross-contamination.
Does a 1.1, 1.2 exclude Mr. Simpson?
No, it doesn't.
Does a D1S80 24, 25 exclude Mr. Simpson?
No, it doesn't.
Referring you to item number 31, the center console, are you familiar with the results that were obtained by the Department of Justice as to that stain?
Yes.
And results were obtained that included a 1.1, a 1.2, and a weaker 1.3 and 4. Is that right?
That's correct.
The 1.1, 1.2 does not exclude Mr. Simpson, does it?
That's correct.
The 1.3 and 4 does not exclude Mr. Goldman. Is that right?
That's correct.
With regard to the D1S80 results of 24 and 25, those are consistent and could have originated from Mr. Simpson. Is that right?
That's correct.
And the 24 could have originated from Mr. Goldman. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right, thank you. That's it for the board at this moment, Your Honor.
All right. Can Dr. Gerdes take his seat back, or are you going to need anything else? Mr. Clarke? Mr. Clarke?
I'm sorry.
Is that the only exhibit we're going to use right now?
Yes.
Why don't we let counsel, Ms. Clarke, why don't you let Mr. Wood handle that? All right, thank you. I recollect we almost killed a juror the last time. Which is why we moved juror number 1, if you recollect. Yes, all right. All right, thank you, Mr. Wooden. Mr. Clarke.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Gerdes, you described having visited the Department of Justice DNA laboratory in the past, correct?
That's correct.
And I believe you described for this case you visited that laboratory twice?
The Department of Justice?
Yes.
No.
How many
Once
times?
in conjunction with this case, and once in conjunction with a previous case.
You have visited the Department of Justice laboratory twice, correct?
Correct.
With regard to the Department of Justice, they have a one-way flow of evidence. Is that right?
Yes, they do.
And I'm referring to evidence flow for purposes of PCR typing.
Yes.
You described yesterday that, in your opinion, evidence at the Los Angeles Police Department was brought back following amplification into the same area that it started out in prior to or at the time of extraction, correct?
Sustain. He just said area.
You testified yesterday that following amplification, DNA, amplified DNA that is, was brought back to the Los Angeles Police Department in the same area, correct?
Oral.
I stated it was brought back to that same location. It's not specifically the same room, but it's the same location.
Okay, so it's not brought back to the same room, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
You've been to the Department of Justice.
Yes.
When they're done amplifying DNA, where do they take it?
It remains in the amplification room.
Where's the amplification room in relationship to the extraction room?
I believe the extraction room is down a hall and in a large room near the entrance of the building, and the amplification room would be a different room, basically in the same building though.
Okay, what are they separated by? How many feet approximately? Department of Justice.
If I recall correctly, the hall would be 50 to 100 feet perhaps.
As far as the Los Angeles Police Department, you took a tour of that lab, correct?
Yes.
I'm sorry, Your Honor, I do have one more exhibit I'd like to use, the photo board, which I believe is Exhibit 281.
I knew it. Mr. Wooden, when you bring that one up, would you just show it briefly to council so they can refamiliarize themselves with what it is? Yes. All right, we've seen that one before, yesterday. Mr. Scheck, your client wants to see that. All right, proceed.
Now, Dr. Gerdes, if I could ask you to step down from the witness stand. And I'm going to refer you to what are the three photographs at the bottom of the diagram that are labeled PiperTech Product Gel Electrophoresis.
Yes.
In your opinion, is that the same area as DNA extraction is conducted at PiperTech as reflected in the top three photographs?
It's in the same building, it's not the exact same room.
What separates those two areas?
There's a hallway of, I don't know how long, I don't recall, for 50 feet perhaps.
There's more than a hallway, isn't there?
Well, there are doors into each of these labs as well.
Aren't they separate secured rooms?
I believe they are separate rooms, yes.
In your opinion, is that the same area, that is the product gel electrophoresis area, as the extraction area?
Oral.
It's not the same area.
All right, thank you. That's sufficient with that board. So, Dr. Gerdes, when you testified yesterday that that material was brought back to the same area, were you incorrect?
Oral.
I don't believe so, because there's another aspect that we didn't really specifically go into because I didn't want to go into a lot of detail. But they're at that amplification room at Parker, excuse me. That is where they autoclave all their solutions. And it's maybe 5 feet from the area where the amplification room is just across a very small little hallway.
Sorry, objection, move to strike, Your Honor, non-responsive.
Sustain. Ask the question again.
Thank you, Your Honor. Yesterday you described these materials as being brought back to the same area at PiperTech, correct?
Yes.
Today you have conceded that in fact those areas, that is the extraction room and the product gel electrophoresis room, are not the same area, correct?
They're not the same room.
Well, they're not the same area, aren't they?
I guess not.
Now, in your opinion, and you've had contact with work done by Gary Sims at the Department of Justice, is that right?
Yes, I have.
And in fact, you've reviewed, not only as a result of this case, but as a result of at least one other case, work done by Gary Sims, correct?
Yes,
And that's included work done using PCR DQ alpha typing.
that's correct.
That work, the work that you reviewed has included work that included PCR D1S80 typing, correct?
That's correct.
It's true, is it not, that in your opinion, Gary Sims is a very careful analyst?
I consider him such, yes.
With regard to actually performing forensic DQ alpha analysis, as well as D1S80 analysis, do you believe you're more qualified than Mr. Sims to conduct that testing?
I don't think there's it wouldn't be difficult for me to do that test. I don't think that either one of us would be more qualified than the other.
Are you familiar with the experience that Mr. Sims has in conducting PCR typing on forensic samples?
Yes,
That is a substantial amount of experience, isn't it?
yes.
How many times have you conducted a PCR analysis on evidentiary material, such as in this case?
We don't do PCR on evidentiary material.
Incidentally, with regard to the Department of Justice, it's your opinion, is it not, that they have an excellent handle on contamination as far as their PCR testing?
It's my opinion that every PCR lab, that this is a problem. I feel that they do an adequate job of attempting to limit that in their lab.
Haven't you previously testified they've done an excellent job?
Yes, I believe they have.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention, if I could, to your employment before you came to work for, and can we call it IAD?
Yes,
That's Immunological Associates of Denver.
that's correct.
That included your being a community college teacher, is that right?
Yes, there was a period of time when I taught at community college in Maui,
For how long, approximately?
5 years.
And as part of that teaching, did you conduct instruction by television in the areas of physiology, anatomy, and biochemistry?
I taught a class of anatomy and physiology on television. The biochemistry was not a TV class, but I taught biochemistry.
And was that, and referring to the TV teaching, you'd be in front of a camera and students could watch your teaching, what, in other parts of the Hawaiian Islands?
That's correct.
After that position, did you go to work for a pineapple company?
It was pretty much at the same time. I did.
And for what period of time?
I believe that was between 8 months to a year.
Following that, where were you employed by?
I was employed by the Veterans Administration in Denver, Colorado, at in charge of the MS Center
And then when did you begin at IAD?
in 1988.
Now, Dr. Gerdes, shifting your attention, and you described the fact yesterday that you have written in the area of DNA. Is that right?
I have publications with regard to various types of DNA analysis, yes.
All right. Could you describe for the jury how many of those publications are about forensic stain analysis?
None of them.
Do you have any publication that deals with the area of PCR contamination in forensics?
No.
Have you written any publication about the unsuitability or why PCR shouldn't be used in forensics?
Well, I consider my testimony to be public record, and I have done that 23 times, and I
Objection,
feel
move to
that's the
strike, Your
best
Honor.
way.
Sustained, answer stricken.
How many publications have you written, Dr. Gerdes, describing why PCR shouldn't be used in forensics?
None.
You have made presentations to people, and I'm talking about like a lecture format, about forensic evidence analysis, correct?
Yes.
How many times?
Twice.
What groups have those been to? In other words, who's the audience been?
Public defenders conferences?
And was that true on both occasions?
Yes.
And those are the only presentations about forensic DNA analysis that you've given.
That's correct.
Are you a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences,
No.
the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors?
No.
Did you attend, for instance, the last annual meeting of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences,
No, I did not.
or the one before that,
No.
or any that have ever occurred?
No.
Have you attended any, well, first of all, are you familiar with the fact that DNA meetings are put on by, for instance, the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
They have forensic meetings, yes.
And have they had, to your knowledge, meetings about DNA?
Yes.
And these are, to your knowledge, are these fairly large meetings?
Perhaps we need to approach the sidebar.
No, I don't, but I think this will become cumulative in a moment.
There's something about the nature of these meetings, Your Honor.
But you can bring that out on redirect, Counsel.
Let me actually withdraw that question and ask another question. Have you attended any meeting put on by a forensic organization?
Not specifically by a forensic organization. I have attended meetings where forensic topics were included as part of a broader meeting.
Objection, move to strike, Your Honor, non-responsive.
Overruled.
Do you regularly talk with forensic experts?
Fairly regularly.
Who are those individuals?
Well, they're conversations in terms of cases that I'm involved with. So Ed Blake, for instance, Mark Taylor, Ben Grunbaum, Simon Ford, to name a few.
Are any of those individuals involved in this case?
I think some of them are in terms of consultants.
What about Dr. Blake?
Yes.
So you spoke to him in this case?
Not about this case.
Did you have any conversations with Dr. Blake about this case?
I had some conversations just with regard to communications with regard to sending me photographs and things like that.
Are you aware that Dr. Blake was present during testing by the Department of Justice in this case?
Yes.
In terms of word testing.
Did you communicate with Dr. Blake about any of what he observed about this case in terms of testing by DOJ?
There was some communication about DNA concentrations. Other than that, no.
So in other words, you didn't have any regular communications whatsoever with Dr. Blake about what he may have seen going on during testing at DOJ?
That's true.
You mentioned another name, Mark Taylor, right?
Yes.
Is Mr. Taylor involved in this case?
He was the individual who accompanied me for the visit to the LAPD and took the photographs.
Is he a consultant in this case as well for the defense?
I'm not sure what his role is. I just know he was involved in that way.
You also mentioned the name Simon Ford, correct?
Yes.
Is Simon Ford a forensic DNA analyst?
Yes.
Does he perform casework?
No.
Does he perform any testing whatsoever on forensic evidence?
Not that I'm aware of.
You also mentioned Benjamin Grunbaum, correct?
Yes.
Does Dr. Grunbaum perform any forensic analysis on casework to your knowledge?
He's been in forensics for probably 30 years, but he doesn't at the moment.
Well, objection, move to strike, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Can you tell us any case he's ever performed using DNA typing?
Not with DNA.
You have no specific forensic training, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
You've never taken a class in forensic science?
That's correct.
You've never taught a class in forensic science?
That's correct.
You have no training whatsoever in police evidence gathering techniques, correct?
No formal training.
Well, is a class formal training or informal training by your use?
It'd be formal.
Have you had any class, been to any workshop whatsoever in the collection of physical evidence in a criminal case?
No.
Is it true that you have no personal experience whatsoever in the collection of physical evidence?
That's true.
have you conducted any validation studies involving the analysis of forensic samples?
No.
It's true, isn't it, that you've conducted no experiments in the forensic area?
That's true.
You've done no studies to determine the effects of sunlight, rain, moisture, etc. on crime scene samples, isn't that correct?
I haven't done any studies myself.
Your expertise, in your view, doesn't involve statistics at all, correct?
That's correct.
As far as this area of forensic DNA analysis, your role is reviewing data from other labs that have conducted testing, correct?
That's true.
And in fact, that's what you've done in this case.
That's true.
You've never tested evidence in a criminal case, correct?
No, I haven't.
You are not an expert in the analysis of evidentiary material using DNA, correct?
I believe I have expertise that speaks to that due to my experience in observing what's going on, reading the forensic literature, and other cases I've been involved with, yes.
Haven't you previously testified that you do not consider yourself an expert in the analysis of evidentiary material using DNA?
I believe I probably stated it the same way I just did.
Do you believe you're an expert in analyzing evidence using DNA typing?
Physically doing the testing?
Correct.
No.
Is it correct that your only connection with forensic cases is reviewing another laboratory's work, usually at the request of a defense attorney?
That's the majority of my experience.
Well, how many times have you been retained by a prosecutor?
Once.
Did that involve a case where a prosecutor was trying to keep DNA evidence out?
Yes.
Was that the only time you've been retained by a prosecutor?
Yes.
So is it correct then, every time you've been retained to look at evidence in an individual case, it has been to try to keep that evidence out?
I think that's vague and overbroad.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Isn't it correct, Dr. Gerdes, that every time you've been retained to review another laboratory's work, it has been with the intent, if possible, of attacking that evidence?
Objection, that's improper in terms of intent.
Sustained.
How many times have you testified as an expert in court in this area?
23 times.
How many times have you been retained to look at laboratory work?
Probably on the order of 30.
You don't testify in all the cases you're retained in, is that right?
That's true. Sometimes cases are, due to the strategy of the particular case, I'm not asked to come in and testify.
Is it correct that sometimes as a result of your review, a defense attorney doesn't call you as a witness?
That's true.
Every time you've testified has been for a criminal defendant, correct?
Yes.
And in each of those testimonies, you have described your opinion about difficulties with PCR, correct?
That's correct.
Now, the laboratories, and I believe you said you've been retained about 30 times, or was that an exact number?
About.
Okay. Is it correct that most of those times it has been to review work done by Dr. Blake?
I wouldn't say most of the time. I would say maybe a third of the time at this point.
So about 10 times? Roughly.
Approximately, yes.
During those 10 times, did you testify?
Yes.
And did you testify to your opinions about the unreliability of results obtained by Dr. Blake?
I testified to my concerns about contamination and PCR in a forensic setting.
And in particular, the reliability of the results reported by Dr. Blake in those cases, correct?
The testimony goes to expressing and explaining the potential risks of this technology.
Well, on those prior occasions, didn't you testify to 12 or more jurors, including alternates, and were trying to give them reasons why they shouldn't believe the results?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustain, rephrase the question.
Your Honor, the Circuit Court may request a sidebar on this line of questioning.
As far as your testimony in this particular case, haven't you testified to the same things that you've testified to 23 times before?
Objection made.
I've been very consistent. This technology has some risks with it, and I think it's important for the jury to know about those so that they can make a reasonable decision as to how much weight to put on this kind of evidence. And yes, I've always testified to that fact.
How many times have you testified about use of polymarker, for instance?
It's a more recent type of gene system. Without looking it up, I would guess probably 4 or 5 times.
And in those instances, have you testified about why those results or results obtained using polymarker shouldn't be believed by a jury?
Objection to the form of that question.
Sustain, rephrase the question.
Have you testified in those instances about your concerns about the reliability of results obtained using polymarker?
Polymarker is another PCR system. It's susceptible to the same arguments, the same reservations.
And,
Yes.
and lastly, how many times have you testified, if any, about the marker D1S80?
Perhaps 3 times,
And-
a small number.
And in those instances, have you again testified about your opinions about the unreliability of the use of that genetic marker?
I testify to the risks that need to be considered in any PCR-based testing system.
I have a concern about these questions.
Well, excuse me.
May I approach about this line of questioning?
No, not at this point. Proceed.
Dr. Gerdes, could you describe for us, please, how many times have you personally conducted just the PCR process itself, this amplification process, at an actual bench, lab bench?
Most of the testing that is done in our lab by PCR right now is done by technicians who are under my direction. I probably have personally done on the order of 100 or so, or more.
Is that something you do now?
Did I personally do testing? No.
Correct. And in fact, you testify, do you not? And I mean in areas, well, let me rephrase that. Do you ever testify as a result of your laboratory's work in areas other than forensic stain analysis like this case? You testify about paternity. Why don't
Yes,
make
I
a note
have
of that?
testified with regards to paternity, yes.
When you testify in that regard, do you testify based on the results obtained by your analysts or technicians?
Yes, I do.
In other words, you didn't personally do the work in those cases wherein you ultimately testify.
That's correct, but I'm responsible to review the work, and if you have appropriate controls, you can look at the documentation of this kind of testing and determine if it was done correctly, if the controls look right, you have photos to look at, and so forth, and pick up problems. So that's my responsibility.
And in fact, this process of reviewing the work of a technician, that's the same thing that occurred in this case with regard to Cellmark, for instance.
I'm sorry, I don't understand you.
Sure. As far as the manner in which Cellmark conducted testing, are you familiar with that testing in this case?
Cellmark's testing, yes.
Yes. For instance, who were the bench analysts who conducted the actual physical testing at Cellmark?
Paula Yates, I believe, was one, and I don't recall the other person.
Would it be Julie Cooper?
Julie Cooper.
In other words, they physically conducted the testing as far as using the reagents, conducting electrophoresis, if that was part of an individual process, and so forth, correct?
That's correct.
And in this particular case, are you familiar with the fact that Robin Cotton testified as an expert?
Yes,
You're familiar with Dr. Cotton?
I am.
You've had contact with her before as a result of your review of work done by Cellmark Diagnostics.
Yes, I have.
Dr. Cotton, in this case, testified based on her review of the work conducted by her analysts, correct?
That's correct.
And that's scientifically appropriate to do so, in your opinion, isn't it?
It is.
You described yesterday, Dr. Gerdes, the fact that your laboratory charges $100 an hour for your work in this case. Is that right?
That's correct.
Has your laboratory received funds so far for your work in this case?
Yes.
How much? approximately?
Uh, Somewhere on the order of 20,000, I would guess. I don't know exactly.
Could it be more?
It could be.
Does that include all of the time you've put into this case up to today and right now?
No.
Can you estimate for us the amount of money that your laboratory is owed as a result of your work, including today?
I would guess you probably would add another 10,000 onto that.
So the total would be approximately $30,000, is that right?
That's correct.
Could that amount be higher than that?
I don't have the figures, so it depends on how long I undergo, how long this goes on.
When were you initially retained by the defense in this case?
If I remember correctly, I was first phoned or called in September, either September or October
Of 94?
of 94.
You've put a lot of time into this case.
Yes,
You've reviewed all the typing strips at the Los Angeles Police Department through approximately May of 93 through August of 94, correct?
that's correct.
That's a fairly large task, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
That took a lot of time.
It did.
You also reviewed, well, let me phrase it as a question. Did you review all of the documentation from the Department of Justice in this case?
I did.
That is a very large amount of material also, is that correct?
It is.
Did you review all of the material from Cellmark Diagnostics in this case?
I did.
That is probably a little less than Department of Justice material, is that right?
It is.
But still a substantial amount of data to look at.
Yes.
When you look at this material, it takes a long period of time, doesn't it?
It does.
You described the fact, well, let me rephrase that if I may. What year did you begin with the laboratory, IAD?
1988.
And what year did you begin testifying as an expert for criminal defendants?
1990.
You described the fact yesterday that there is a replacement for you that takes your place when you're either gone or working on other cases, that is criminal cases?
Well, not specifically. It's not like they hire someone to come in. Basically, there are 3 individuals who are directors of this laboratory. We're all directors. And while I'm gone, someone has to take over those responsibilities. They take over.
Okay, so the laboratory doesn't bring in another person,
No.
that is, hires an outside individual.
No, they don't.
Basically, the other directors in your lab, was that the term?
Yes.
They pick up the slack, for lack of a better term?
Yes.
So your laboratory doesn't lose any money in terms of having to pay anyone else?
Not specifically.
Could I have just a moment, Your Honor? As far as your salary, well, do you receive a salary?
Yes, I do.
Does that work out to $100 an hour?
I believe it does. No, it doesn't. It's less than that.
It's substantially less, isn't it?
Can you tell me a yearly figure for $100 an hour so that it'll make it easy for me?
Well, let's see. Let's take an 8-hour day. That's about $800 a day. And how much would that be a week?
Okay, 5,600.
Okay.
So,
How about a 5-day work week instead of 7?
well, okay. Well, I work 7 days a week. Okay, so 4,000. So, okay, we're talking about 16,000.
Over 200,000?
No, it would be about half
Okay.
of that.
Can you estimate for us approximately how much your laboratory has profited, how much money they've taken in from your testimony and work in criminal cases? Is there any way you
Total?
put a rough estimate, total?
Over the 5 years, perhaps somewhere on the order of 80,000. or maybe 100,000 over 5 years.
So is it correct then that your laboratory is billing approximately 2 times or twice as much as you make when you're at home working in the lab?
You could interpret it that way.
All right, Dr. Gerdes, I'd like to shift your attention to RFLP typing. You're familiar with it, correct?
Yes,
You have no disagreement whatsoever with its reliability, correct?
that's correct.
In fact, it's been used in science for over 10 years. Is that safe to say?
Yes,
It's developed by Sir Alec Jeffreys in London along with Dr. White, working
Well,
independently.
the underlying scientific principles actually are traced back to an individual named Southern who developed the Southern blotting technique. And those individuals you mentioned were involved in the first to apply it for forensics.
And it's a technology that's used around the world, correct?
That's correct.
Life and death decisions are made based on results using RFLP typing?
I guess you could say that.
Well, diagnosing a disease that might kill a person, that's a life and death matter, isn't it?
Yes,
And it's used to diagnose a whole host of diseases, correct?
it's primarily used in diagnosing genetic diseases and in the looking at certain gene alterations involved in some cancers.
It's used to look at, for instance, whether a person suffers from cystic fibrosis, right?
That's a genetic disease, yes.
It's used to determine whether or not a person has, for instance, muscular dystrophy.
Yes,
It's used to determine whether or not tissue can be transplanted, as you described yesterday, from one person to another.
most labs don't use RFLP at this point.
What do they use now?
They use PCR-based testing.
The same PCR that you described yesterday. The
This-
technology.
The technology is the same, yes.
And in fact, isn't it true that there are a whole host of uses of RFLP typing?
Yes,
You use the RFLP technique in your paternity work, correct?
yes,
Does that ever involve, for instance, making interpretations on bands that might not look exactly like another band from another sample?
it does.
In other words, it involves some interpretation, correct?
That's correct.
You may see faint bands, is that right?
Occasionally,
You may see, as you've used the term, artifacts.
that's true.
Incidentally, when you have conducted a paternity test, does that involve numbers at all when you report results?
Yes, it does.
In other words, you calculate a statistical probability or whatever term to describe how unusual it is to see these two samples matching, for instance, from a child and an alleged father.
We calculate that using what's called Bayesian statistics, which is different than what is used in a forensic setting, but it's statistics.
And does it involve multiplying results over more than one genetic marker?
It does.
IAD doesn't use RFLP typing in any forensic work, that is, by anyone in the laboratory, correct?
That's correct.
Setting aside paternity.
That's correct.
Are you aware of the number of labs using RFLP typing in forensic stain analysis?
I don't know the exact number. I know there are quite a few using that,
It's in the hundreds, isn't it?
perhaps.
Dr. Gerdes, are you offering an opinion to this jury that forensic PCR typing doesn't produce accurate results? That question.
The PCR process itself, the method of amplifying DNA, is a sound scientific principle. But the way in which it is currently, basically my opinion is it's inadequately controlled in forensic testing at the moment. And it hasn't been adequately validated for that technology transfer. That's my testimony.
And you have testified to that for the last 5 years, correct?
I have.
You've offered that opinion all 23 times you've testified, correct?
Yes,
I do have an objection at this point. It has to do, it's a legal ruling with respect to the nature of those proceedings. I think this is...
Excuse me, object to the objection also, Your Honor.
Noted.
Would request a sidebar.
Let's move on.
Dr. Gerdes, in your opinion, then, is PCR also not appropriate to use to exclude people in forensic cases?
That's correct.
Can't use it to include somebody?
That's right.
Can't use it to exclude someone?
The potential error, in my opinion, of additional dots due to contamination could just as likely cause a false exclusion as inclusion.
As you're using the terms inclusion and exclusion, what do you mean? Just to make sure we're talking the
Well,
same
inclusion would mean that you match a sample with an individual that results in them being accused of a crime, in this sense. And exclusion would be that due to that testing, you would come up with a result that would say that they could not have done it.
You do hold the opinion that the use of PCR in medical uses, however, is sufficient in terms of sufficient reliability to be used to produce accurate results.
I do, based on all of the things we talked about yesterday, where we discussed all of those items in terms of technology transfer and the relative risks of the two.
As far as this PCR process, that was invented by Dr. Kerry Mullis, correct?
That's correct.
Is he present in the audience?
He is.
Where is he?
He's sitting second individual over on the first row behind the desk there.
Between Mr. Allman and next to Mr. Douglas,
Yes.
and behind Mr. Scheck.
Isn't it correct, Dr. Gerdes, that your view that PCR is okay to use in medical uses is due to the number of genetic markers that are available to test and the fact that you can confirm those results with other tests?
Compound.
Is it correct that it's your belief that PCR is acceptable to use in medical diagnostics or medical uses because...
I'm sorry. Please finish the question. I'm sorry.
I'll start it again if I may. Thank you. Is it correct, Dr. Gerdes, that your opinion about the scientific acceptance in terms of why you believe it's appropriate to use, I'm referring to PCR in medical diagnostic uses, is based on the number of genetic markers you can look at? That's one reason.
My objection here is to specifically which applications of PCR. I think it's vague.
It's vague. Sustain.
When you feel, and you offered the opinion that the use of PCR in medical uses is appropriate, correct?
It is.
What uses are you referring to?
There are a variety of specific applications. The ones that we use in my lab are the detection of infectious agents such as cytomegalovirus or chlamydia, and the typing of HLA for the purpose of bone marrow transplant, where you know you were working with a sample from a given individual.
Okay, let's start with CMV. That's a virus, correct?
That's correct.
And can we use the term CMV as a
Yes,
shorthand manner?
yes.
When you attempt to diagnose, and is that what you do, use PCR to attempt to diagnose the presence of CMV?
That's correct.
Do you look at just one genetic marker?
Yes, we do.
When you test for the disease, and is it proper to call chlamydia a disease?
Yes.
How many markers do you look at for that particular item?
The kit that is includes one specific marker that you look for.
Is there any significance to looking at multiple markers in an individual sample in the medical arena?
Under certain circumstances, I think that would be a good idea.
As far as criminal cases, do you feel it's a good idea to look at more than one marker?
It gives you additional information.
And the more information that's available, the better, right?
Correct.
As far as PCR, is it correct that there are thousands of U.S. laboratories using PCR?
I think that's a fair statement.
Life and death decisions are made based on the results of PCR typing every day, correct?
Yes.
PCR is used to find out, for instance, if food or dairy products have organisms in them that shouldn't be there, right?
I'm not aware of that. It certainly is possible.
Is it used to diagnose whether or not fetuses have diseases?
Yes.
It's used to diagnose many, if not most, of the same diseases that RFLP typing is either used today or was previously used. Is that right?
That's true.
Incidentally, as far as disease diagnosis, and you have some experience in that area, correct?
That's correct.
As far as the use of PCR, are the results of those diagnoses always clear-cut?
Not always.
In other words, it isn't always either there's a real clear answer that the person has it or there's a real clear answer that the person doesn't, right?
That's correct.
And there are some diseases where there's a gray area in between those two, isn't that right?
That's true.
The results of those uses of PCR are utilized by doctors to counsel people on whether they have a disease, correct?
There, in this situation that you've set up, they would obviously look at other clinical factors to try and make a determination. It would be one aspect of their decision in terms of their diagnosis.
And isn't it true that in many of those instances, doctors have to counsel patients when they have to tell them, you may or may not have this disease?
That's true.
Is that a significant decision in your viewpoint as to what the patient decides?
Yes.
Now, this technology involving PCR has been used to identify American war dead, correct?
Yes.
Including in the Persian Gulf War?
I'm familiar with that, yes.
And isn't it true Cellmark was a laboratory that performed that testing for the United States government?
I believe it was.
Doug, further along these lines, I think it's cumulative and
Overruled. Overruled.
Is it correct, Dr. Gerdes, that there are over 14,000 publications on the use of PCR, scientific publications?
That's true.
PCR is used by every molecular biology lab that you're aware of, correct?
Absolutely.
Is it your opinion that there's no self-respecting molecular biologist alive who doesn't use PCR right now?
I think that's a fair statement.
Now, PCR in your own lab at IAD has been used since what year?
We started using it when I arrived at IED, 1988 or shortly thereafter.
That was, well, let me rephrase that. Already in place in your laboratory were RFLP techniques, correct?
No, actually, I was hired to set those up.
So when you came into the lab, you introduced both RFLP typing and PCR typing.
That's correct.
Your laboratory then has used PCR either in a development phase or in an actual casework phase then for about 7 years. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Is it correct that most of the current work that your laboratory performs is done by PCR?
No, that's not true.
What percentage would you estimate of the casework at your lab? Well, let's broaden it out. What percentage would you estimate of all the work conducted in your laboratory is done by PCR?
Approximately 30%.
Does that include casework,
Yes.
where you report out results following the use of PCR in the areas of, for instance, whether a person has CMV?
That's correct. I wouldn't be 30% of the CMV diagnosis. The problem is certain techniques use PCR, and we use them for that. Other techniques use other scientific methods, and we do a wide range of different tests.
Now, you routinely use PCR for this virus detection,
For CMV,
right?
we do, yes.
And that's a viral infection, right?
Correct.
What is it you actually analyze? What do you receive in the lab to look at?
We receive a blood specimen.
Is that a difficult diagnosis?
It is a difficult diagnosis in terms of traditional methods. I feel that PCR has made it, our quantitative PCR, once it was adapted to a quantitative method, has made that diagnosis more reliable.
As far as this virus use of PCR, let me rephrase that if I might. In your use of PCR to detect this virus, are you looking for levels of the virus as opposed to whether a particular allele is present?
That's correct.
So you're interpreting a range of possible data and make a decision within that range whether or not the virus is there.
Number one, is it there? And number two, how much is there?
Do you have to make any subjective interpretations about the levels as far as making a conclusion whether the person has it?
It's an objective conclusion based on a standard curve that we have derived and the methodology we've derived so that we can precisely measure levels of the DNA from CMZ.
Incidentally, and I'm not sure the term came up yesterday, but it may have, but one of the instruments used in PCR frequently is called a thermal cycler. Is that right?
That's correct.
And your laboratory, I assume, has one or more thermal cyclers?
Yes.
Who manufactures that product?
Perkin-Elmer.
Also, and you're aware of testimony, are you not, about a corporation referred to as Roche?
Correct.
And in fact, Roche manufactures the typing kit used in this case for DQ alpha, polymarker, and the other PCR marker, in this case D1S80.
That's correct.
Is there any relationship between Perkin-Elmer and Roche?
Yes.
What's that?
I don't know the details, but basically Roche holds the licensing, the patent, if you will, for the PCR process, and they have negotiated a marketing agreement through Perkin-Elmer for Perkin-Elmer to market the kits that Roche develops.
So your laboratory bought this thermal cycler from Perkin-Elmer, who is related to Roche, correct?
Correct.
In your opinion, is that thermal cycler that you used reliable?
That's the best thermal cycler on the market, in my opinion.
Does it have a model number?
The one we use is called a 9600. There are other models, but that's the one that we have.
How many samples can you place in that thermal cycler at one time?
It has a capability of 96.
Incidentally, when let me rephrase it. Your technicians use the thermal cycler, correct?
That's correct.
And they place tubes in the various wells in the thermal cycler?
That's correct.
Do they change gloves between every sample that they touch when they put in the samples?
They change gloves between samples when they prepare those tubes.
That's
I
not
mean,
what
the
I'm
tubes the tubes are in strips so that after you've placed them, I mean, once you've loaded the tube, then you put it in the thermocycler. You're carrying like a rack of tubes that are placed in.
When they place tubes, individual tubes into the thermal cycler, do they change gloves between each tube?
Not when they're placing it in the thermocycler.
What's the most number of samples that have been run in that cycler at one time?
It has a capability of 96.
What's the most that have been run in your laboratory
In
at
my
one time?
laboratory,
Correct.
I think there have been a couple of occasions where we've run all 96.
And that's the most that it'll hold, correct?
Correct. That wasn't on casework, however.
Do you know what type of thermal cycler the Los Angeles Police Department uses?
They have the 9600 as well.
Same exact thermal cycler that you have in terms of the model and its capabilities.
Correct.
What about the Department of Justice?
I think they have the 480, if I remember correctly, which is the model that preceded the 9600.
Is there anything in your opinion about the model 480 that's unreliable as opposed to the 9600?
No.
What about Cellmark?
They also, I believe they also have the 480.
Incidentally, you also described bone marrow transplant tests that are performed in your lab, correct?
Correct.
Do those use PCR in any manner?
Yes, they do.
And you've also described this national registry, correct?
Correct.
The National Registry requires, for purposes of inclusion in this registry, PCR typing be done, correct?
That's correct.
And in particular, they require that a particular genetic marker region be used to conduct that typing, correct?
That's correct.
That's the HLA region?
It's not the same, it's not DQ alpha. It's another HLA gene. It's called DR beta.
Okay, my question was, is that part of the HLA gene?
It's part of that complex, but there are more than one gene in that complex, so it's not the same gene, but it's in the same area.
Is it correct then that the DQ alpha gene is in the same area as the exact gene that you test in your laboratory for bone marrow typing?
Yes,
You've mentioned DQ alpha and I believe DQ beta yesterday as well.
yes,
Are they related?
yes, they are.
And I think you may have mentioned DR as well. Are these just different particular genes that are located close to one another?
Yes,
Do you test the DQ beta gene in your lab?
yes,
Do you test the DR gene in your lab?
yes,
Isn't it correct that by testing more than one gene, you increase the likelihood of your finding important information in your work in your laboratory?
yes.
Do you use PCR for any other purposes other than bone marrow transplant information and looking for CMV?
We are very close to using it for the purpose of looking at donors, as I explained the other day, in terms of looking for infectious agents in donors.
Incidentally, as far as the actual process of conducting PCR typing, amplification and then typing, that process in a broad sense is the same whether it's medical or forensic, correct?
The basic setting up of the method in terms of how it's set up, that's the same, yes.
In your lab, do you ever test degraded samples?
No,
Is it your testimony that you've never conducted any casework analysis on a degraded sample?
yes,
As far as the use of PCR in other laboratories, and let's go outside criminal cases and forensic, isn't it correct that PCR is used on degraded samples?
it's being used for that.
What are some examples of that?
In the forensic community?
No, outside forensics.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question then. I'm
Okay.
having a hard time thinking of one.
Are you aware of the use of PCR, for instance, in the study of endangered animals?
This is irrelevant.
No, I'm not.
You've never heard of it?
No,
Are you aware of the use of PCR? Well, you are aware of the use of PCR to identify remains of war dead, correct?
It's in a different context.
I'm aware that is done.
Well, wasn't it
Specifically degraded samples, correct?
correct?
All right, proceed.
You're aware that it's done on war dead?
We've established that.
Isn't it correct that that PCR typing was used on, for instance, soldiers who were brutally killed in the Persian Gulf War?
Sustained. You've already asked that.
All right. Isn't it true that with regard to that usage, that those are bodies that have been violently killed out in the desert?
Objection to this line at this point, Your Honor.
Overruled. Goes to the, this is in the context of degraded samples.
Correct.
All right, proceed.
Yes, that's true.
Would you consider a body that's been out in the desert for hours or days degraded?
Yes,
PCR has been used to type mummies, isn't that correct?
yes,
Is that a degraded sample?
I'm sure it is.
You described, for instance, the use of this. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that question. Your work in your laboratory is mainly with infectious materials as far as PCR, right?
Well, we do both infectious materials as well as HLA typing, and those I don't think would be considered, the registry individuals are not considered to be infectious. Of course, you handle everything as though it's potentially infectious.
Is PCR used to, for instance, type the presence of certain diseases in samples that have been obtained during a biopsy? For instance, a portion removed from a person's body.
Occasionally it can be done for that.
Is that a sterile sample?
It's collected sterilely in an operating room, for instance.
Okay, but is the sample sterile, or as you've used the term, was it aseptic?
Well, certainly tissue is sterile when you collect it unless it's infected.
And if it's infected, it isn't sterile, is it?
No.
And in fact, those samples are frequently sent out for PCR typing to determine whether or not there is a disease or infection there, right?
Yes, but what you're looking for there is the infection.
Are you aware of the use of PCR on samples that have been preserved in paraffin?
PCR has been used for that.
What is a sample preserved in paraffin? Could you describe that?
In the normal process of doing what's called pathology, tissue samples are frequently embedded with this wax or paraffin that allows you to cut sections and put them on a microscope slide and see the morphology, the architecture of the cells, and pathologists then can look at that and determine disease states.
Are those samples ever degraded?
I wouldn't consider it degraded. They're basically fixed and then embedded with this paraffin, and the process itself results in cross-linking of the protein in the sample to the DNA, so that it's very difficult to extract the DNA after that.
Well, you say you wouldn't consider it degraded. These can be samples that are years old, can't they?
Yes, but they're fixed and embedded in paraffin that pretty much preserves them.
Well, is it your testimony that those samples that are preserved in paraffin, the DNA is in exactly as good a form as it was when it was removed?
Yes, it is.
So there's no degradation in those samples that may be years old, period.
There's no degradation in that section. When you try and extract the DNA, because of the cross-linkage, you get DNA that is in smaller pieces. But it's not due to any kind of contamination with bacteria that eat, nothing like that.
That never happens.
Not in those sections.
There's a fairly common term known as a pap smear, is that right?
Yes,
And that's taken from women as part of an analysis, correct? Or for purposes of an analysis.
yes.
In your opinion, is that an example of a sample that is sterile?
No, it's not sterile.
That sample, while not sterile, is still tested to determine whether or not there may be a disease present in that individual.
Yeah, but what you're misunderstanding is you're testing for an infectious agent in that. You're not testing for a specific human gene. So you're looking for the contaminant in this case.
Well,
You're looking for the bacterial contaminant.
are there any other contaminants that might be present in that sample?
There are a variety of things, I'm sure, but
The presence of those variety of contaminants doesn't stop that sample from being tested for the disease that's being looked for, correct?
the PCR is very precise, and you design it so that you're only looking for the specific microorganism you're interested in, such as chlamydia, which we do in our lab. That particular PCR will not detect herpes or a variety of other things that perhaps might be in that sample. It's designed to very specifically look for only the chlamydia organism.
So in other words, one of the important components or parts of PCR typing is designing it to look for what the scientist is trying to find.
That's true, and if you have a system that looks just simply for human DNA, that's where the problem comes in.
Well, objection, move to strike the last portion of the answer, Your Honor. As far as known samples in your lab, do you use any cards? And by card, I mean a card that a portion of a liquid blood sample would be poured onto so that it can be used in that form.
Never.
Are you aware of that in the that is its use in the medical diagnostic area?
I believe there are some areas where they're doing that, looking for infectious. Perhaps I've read papers on hepatitis, for instance, where they'll do that. But again, you're misunderstanding. In that case, you're looking for the hepatitis organism, so you have a
I'm
specific
sorry, Your Honor.
mechanism.
Objection, move to strike the last portion. As far as DNA, DNA is something that basically degrades, correct?
It can.
And it can degrade to the point where there's no activity left, or the DNA perishes, for lack of a better term.
Well, degradation just simply means that due to whatever reason, the DNA is this long, stringy molecule. It starts getting chopped up into smaller and smaller pieces. Ultimately, you end up with such small pieces that when you attempt to analyze it, you can't.
Focusing on samples, and let's just take a blood stain, for instance, that's outside. Something outside can be exposed to sunlight, right?
Yes.
Sunlight doesn't change a DNA type, does it?
No.
Rain doesn't change a DNA type, does it?
No.
Soil doesn't change a type?
No.
Leaves don't change a DNA type?
No.
Those things can, however, lead to DNA being less and less typable. In other words, the DNA be at levels where it becomes more difficult to get an answer, if one can get an answer at all.
That's correct.
Isn't it correct that the difference between medical specimens that are subjected to PCR and forensic specimens is where the sample came from?
That's one difference.
That's the most important difference, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, you're familiar in this case of testimony that has described that following PCR, several genetic markers were typed using this dot blot technique.
Yes.
And in fact, you've observed the use of that technique in all approximately 30 cases you've reviewed, right?
Correct.
You use dot blotting in your own laboratory, correct?
The direct dot blotting, yes. It's a little different, but the same, essentially the same.
In other words, whether direct or indirect, that's not a major difference, or is that a significant difference in terms of the opinions you've offered over the last 2 days?
I don't believe so.
That dot blotting in your laboratory includes dot blotting following PCR on vaginal specimens, correct?
No, we don't do dot blotting on vaginal specimens.
Have you ever done dot blotting on vaginal specimens in your laboratory?
At one time, we did look for an organism, human papillomavirus, using that technology, but we don't at the moment.
I hope that term has is it also nicknamed HPV?
Yes.
Do you take photographs of the dot blots in your laboratory?
Yes. Well, it depends. I mean, basically, our system at the moment, the way we run dot blots is the detection methodology is what's called chemiluminescence, and it results in basically the release of light during the reaction. And so it's more like developing a photograph. So what we really keep are what would be similar to the negatives.
All right. As far as, have you ever photographed dot blots in your laboratory?
We've either used autoradiography or chemiluminescence, so I don't believe so.
As far as your own experience in criminal cases, that has included looking at photographs of dot blots, correct?
Yes.
Looking at a photograph isn't the same as looking at a strip live, correct?
That's correct.
And in fact, would it be correct to say that the analyst who sees a dot blot strip live is in a better position to see exactly the reactions that have occurred?
One of the limitations of this system is those dots fade fairly rapidly. So it is true that the analyst might see something that would fade away, and then when you photograph it, it wouldn't be present in the photo where it could have been there in the original.
Are errors made in your laboratory during testing?
I think errors are a fact of life. Everyone makes errors.
Are errors made in the diagnostic and clinical work in your laboratory?
Errors are made. We do everything we can to prevent errors, and I can't say that we've never made an error. They are a fact of life.
Well, some of the techniques that you use or have used in your laboratory have a certain error rate, don't they?
Yes.
You've tested for HIV in your laboratory in the past, correct?
Yes.
And do you currently test for HIV?
Yes.
Incidentally, does HIV cause AIDS?
I guess that's a controversial question.
I think he testified to that yesterday. It's in the record.
It's HIV is the
Let's let Dr.
prominent
Well, hold
consensus
on,
is it does
hold on,
cause AIDS.
Hold on. Let's move on to something else.
Very well. As far as this HIV testing in your laboratory, have there been sort of two phases to that HIV testing using PCR?
I'm not sure what you're getting at.
Okay. As far as HIV testing, how do you conduct that testing, just in terms of the technology used?
Well, at the present time, for the purpose of screening donors, if that's what you're asking about, we use what's called a serological technique, which
Okay, and
is looking at antibodies as opposed to looking at DNA.
in broad terms, would that be comparable as far as the broad technology to the serology testing conducted by the Los Angeles Police Department in this case?
I guess so.
As far as that testing, did that then lead to a different form or different method of testing for HIV in your laboratory?
Well, it didn't really lead to it. It's just that that particular way of looking for a virus is